iedereen. Leuk dat u er bent. En de rest van dit anderhalf uur zullen we Engels spreken. Maar ik wou u toch even graag in goed Nederlands welkom heten in deze theaterzaal voor dit debat over unseen suffering. So, thank you for coming, and we will make sure that you won't regret coming, and that's not on me. That's going to be thanks to the panel and the discussion that they will be having. The basic idea is that we will be discussing, that we will be talking, having a conversation about unseen suffering, unseen lives, about those conflicts, those many conflicts that are happening at this very moment and of which we see very little in media, that are very seldom discussed in Parliament, and that are even mostly absent in our public discussions in cafes or at home or with friends. So that's the subject, and we have an eminent panel to look into the issue. To my far right hand, your left hand, is Younis Kamil Abdul-Salem. Younis is a researcher, a doctoral student at the VUB in Brussels. He lives in Germany, and he is from Sudan, and that's the angle that he will take in this discussion. But we won't restrict Younis to his Sudanese background. He's just as much an avid watcher of media as every one of us. I have to see Eline Huibert from Open University in Holland will be contributing from her background as a researcher, trying to understand what media and news about conflicts, about distant conflicts, about unknown suffering, but also of some very visible suffering, what that does with people and why people watch it or avoid it, things like that. And then of course Stan Verkruijsen, most of you know Stan, he's working at VRT as a journalist, and he's both covering climate issues and, let's say, African news, which brings him every now and then to places that should be more in the news, or that you would want to get out of the news because finally their suffering would be over. But most places are still going through the suffering. Those are the panelists. While we are talking, thinking, exchanging, Sarah Zeebroek behind us will be making live covering of our conversation in her artwork. So that's what you will see appearing soon, I guess, as Sarah started to draw up some of that beautiful artwork that we know that she can make. Voila. There are, at present, more than 100, some organizations say 110, armed conflicts taking place in the world today. I would think that most of us, and even myself who has been a professional journalist covering world news for more than 35 years, would have difficulty naming more than 30, which already comes to show the point. There is a lot of conflicts in the world that are happening, that are not on top of our mind, that are not visible. Before I go further, I forgot, this debate has been organized by the Hannah Arendt Instituut. And, well, Hannah is right here. She won't be intervening, but she's right next to us, looking over our shoulder to see if our analysis fits with her thinking. No, that's just a joke. Hannah is very tolerant to open discussions. But Younis, maybe let's start with you. I said you will be looking at the issue from the background of Sudan. That's not restrictive, but let's start in Sudan. Most people might know that there is a problem in Sudan, but could you give us a brief idea of what the extent, what is the size, what is the actual conflict taking place in Sudan today?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a very personal matter. It's especially in the light of the topic, or in the name of the light of the topic, unseen suffering for someone who has its roots in Sudan. It's a very emotional thing to talk about what is happening there, because no one else is talking about it, or you have to actively search for it to find that there's something going on. And it happens very often to me that I talk to friends, very close friends, who say, oh, I didn't know that there's a war in your country. And coming back to your question is, it's nothing works anymore in Sudan. Nothing works in any place anymore in Sudan. I left Sudan with the beginning of this conflict, and since then children of my cousins haven't been educated, haven't been going to school since then. Hospitals are not working anymore. There's unbelievable cruelty going on, not in the far away from the capital, no, in the central of the capital. 7 of my family members, of my closest family members, have been murdered or have been or died because of indirect consequences, like they didn't get the treatment they needed or so. So it's really, imagine Belgium and nothing works anymore. No police, no justice, no hospital, really nothing. Yeah, and 100% of my family doesn't live in the house they have lived before the 15th of April of 2023. So everybody's on the run. Some of them are in Egypt, some of them are in Ethiopia, some of them just, so the poorest, they just tried to get over the bridge to the other side of the capital. I'm originally from Khartoum, and Khartoum is a divided city between, so the Nile divides the city, and they just managed to get over the bridge to the other part of the city. So everybody is on the run, you know, and really nothing is working anymore except of fighting.
Yeah. Younis, you start out with saying it's very personal, and then you give us a slight idea of what that means for your family and for people that you've known, and for people in general. Is that important for you to, instead of saying there's 30,000 people died or 3 million people are on the run, that you make it personal? How important is that as a starting point?
First of all, I say it because it is important, because it is personal. It is super personal to me, and since you have mentioned numbers, the numbers I have heard vary between 100 and 150,000 people who have died, and 15 to 20 million people who are fleeing. So these are the numbers. But to be honest, it is personal because I can't even grasp these numbers. For me, I just see the personal suffering. I see my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, who ask me constantly to send money, to send whatever kind of help. So everything in this conflict is personal to me. And also, I mentioned it in the very early stage of what I said. I was there when the conflict started, and this is also super personal because I, with my German citizenship, was able to leave the country and had to leave the rest of my family behind. Just try to think how difficult this is for you to leave your cousins, your aunts, where you grew up. You leave them behind because you just have another passport in your hand.
Yeah. The conflict, the new conflict, has been going on for a year and a half now. And as you mentioned before, even close friends of yours, or the public in general for sure, have no idea that it is happening, what is happening, and what it means. What does that invisibility of the conflict mean to you, who is so personally touched by it?
I can't really answer your question from my own perspective, but more from the perspective of my family in Sudan, which constantly asks me, really one of the most questions they ask me is, do people know what's happening here? Do they know in Europe that this is happening to us? And I think in this question lies a deep hope in humanity that if they know, will they come to help? And the more I have to say, yeah, they know in a way, there is reporting about it, but still nothing moves, nothing changes. This hope in humanity fades away more and more. And one sentence I hear more often, or even more and more in the talks with my family is, okay, we don't want anything from you anymore. We will rely on ourselves. Yeah? And this is a sentence I also hear when I observe the conflict in Gaza. When this is over, we don't want anything from you anymore, because you left us.
And you is Europe.
You is very clearly Europe, white Europe.
Yeah. We'll come back to that, because that's a crucial point that you already bring up, and we'll delve into that later. But I wanted to first get to know the panel a little bit. Stan, you have been on the field, you have been trying to report on some of the ongoing conflicts, specifically in Africa. Why is it so difficult to get these conflicts out in the media, to get them to the public, to move things? Why are they invisible?
There are a lot of reasons for that, but let me start with Sudan. When the conflict broke out in Sudan, we really tried to get there, to get in Sudan, but that seemed impossible. We tried via Saudi Arabia, going to Port Sudan, Egypt, and last what I did was going to Chad to report on the conflict from Chad, from on the border with Sudan. Also that, going to Chad and to the border, it takes 3 days to get there, and very difficult to work over there. So it's not easy. It's like my colleagues who follow the conflict in the Middle East, the same day they take the plane to Beirut, they go into Syria, the same day they go to Tel Aviv, and they are reporting from in Israel. Of course, Gaza is very difficult to get in. Secondly, Gaza, we get constantly images from the social media about Gaza. In Sudan, almost none. So it was, for television news, you need images to tell the story. So it was very difficult to tell the story in the beginning because there were no images. We didn't know how was the situation in Khartoum when there was so much fighting. So we tried to call people, and we did that. We had some testimonies and tried to do it that way. So it's difficult in very much of these countries. There is no images coming out, and it's very difficult to get in. But of course, it's more than this.
We'll get back to that point of media logic. Like you say, we need images. That's a media logic argument. We'll come back to that. But as a journalist, do you feel it is crucial to your work to bring to the public conflicts or suffering that is otherwise invisible? Or is that one of the things that you want to do? How important do you think is that at all?
To me personally, it's very important. For example, Sudan is the biggest humanitarian crisis of the moment in the world. Sudan is the biggest refugee crisis in the world at this moment. But the aid organization, the big international aid organizations, don't get the funds to help these people. I think it's one of the first times that such a major conflict or such a major crisis doesn't get or gets so little funds. When I was in Chad in April or May, only 6% was funded. So to help these people, the refugees in Chad, for example, and people in Sudan, you have to show what's happening there. And apparently now all the attention of the world is going to Ukraine, Gaza, and now Syria, and not to all these other conflicts. So it's very important just for the people to get help, to give them the feeling that they are here, that you go there and report on the conflicts that remain unseen.
Yeah, Eileen, you're doing research on the impact of conflict reporting, of violent news often. Do you think people, the audience, the public, we all, are we asking for that news, or are we trying to avoid it?
A good question. I think you will find that a lot of people are avoiding news. All negative news at the moment is being avoided by a lot of people, which is something that we do find. And I think it's one of the issues of people is avoiding this news, but I think the question is, why are we avoiding this news? Because I'm listening to the stories here and considering why aren't we paying attention to these images. One of the things that I'm thinking about is from the perspective of a journalist, but also from the perspective of an audience. With news, the question is always, what's new? And it's terrible to say, but the conflict in Sudan isn't new. So then the attention of what's happening becomes incredibly difficult for journalists to talk about in a way that still is able to raise the interest of people here. And this is a very cold and very rational way of interpreting how we are looking at conflict. We are looking at it that way.
But do you have, from your research, do you have can you map the reaction of the audience to, say, reporting about Gaza or Ukraine? Those are visible conflicts, so that might tell us something about how people would react if they get more of that reporting.
Yeah. I think what happens when you are, what I've found in looking into how people respond to these images of distant suffering, there's a couple of different things happening at the same time that aren't necessarily complementary, but rather confusing actually. Because what happens when you see people suffering very far away, from a moral perspective, you're considering yourself as a human being ethical and thinking, I should do something. I should do something. So that's the first, or it's one of the moral correct things to think. But at the same time, when you look at the suffering, you don't know what to do. So you feel powerless. And when you feel powerless, you get sad, or you don't do anything, or you will try to protect yourself emotionally by not watching anymore and avoiding news altogether. So this is a sense of powerlessness that results in either sadness or news avoidance. And at the same time, so there's, or what can happen is that you feel like you should do something from a moral perspective, but you don't even feel anything anymore because you see distant suffering, but you think, well, I've seen that yesterday. It doesn't do anything anymore. It doesn't help for me. But this is also connected to not knowing what to do with something. So it's very often contradictory. I should do something, but I can't do anything. I should feel something, and I don't feel anything.
Yeah. Younis, you want to?
Yeah, I want to support what you say. This feeling of powerlessness can be very powerful. Yeah, I spent the first year of this conflict watching every news, every Instagram video I find, and the more I had this feeling of I can't help. Yeah, the more I fell into, yeah, you can say, into a depression or feeling depressed and powerless. And I can really tell you from my personal perspective, I couldn't focus on my work anymore. And whatever I did, I couldn't focus on my family, on my daily living here. So I started avoiding watching these news. And in addition to this, as a Muslim person that identifies as a Muslim, I was also very, very negatively affected by the reporting about Gaza. And I also started doing the same, I don't want to say mistake, the same thing. I watched everything on my social media channel, which really led to a feeling of I can't do anything. And then there's also an additional layer to this. If you start avoiding it, then you get a feeling of I'm not supporting anymore. So they have to go through it, and I don't even watch what's happening. And this is another layer on top of this. So whatever you do, you can't do the right thing if you are not able to help. So, and I solved it for myself that I try to help wherever I can. I collect donations, I send money, I call very regularly, I try to stay in touch to give moral or mental support, whatever. I will fly to Egypt next week to support my family, to see my family, those who fled to Egypt. So this is how I try to overcome these feelings, but I really want to support. This is a very strong feeling, and it's a very ugly feeling.
Eline, to pick up on that further, what Younis is saying is the more personally you're connected to the conflict, the more you get this dilemma between overreaction and personal guilt, almost, of not being able to do something. But we started with saying there's 100 conflicts going on. Not just in Sudan, not just in Gaza, Syria or Ukraine, but in Eastern Congo, in Yemen, in Myanmar, in 110 armed conflicts are going on today. Can we even cope with that? I mean, we're looking at it from the question, should we see, or why are some conflicts and some suffering, why is it not seen? But can we even cope with the amount of suffering that is taking place on this globe every day? How do you react to that as a researcher or as a person?
That is a very good question, and I think one of the reasons why people are avoiding news is because of this. It's not reasonable or realistic to be caring about every single conflict that's going on. But at the same time, the way we're looking at it right now is also not exactly fair, because some conflicts get way more attention than others, disproportional. And I think one of the underlying reasons of what we see is happening is there is a certain kind of priority that we have in news attention that is very much based on a what's in it for me kind of reason. What's in it for us? So when something is to matter that actually has to do with Flanders or Belgium or Europe, we will be paying attention to it much more than when it's far away and there is nothing in it for us, or so remote that it's not very obvious. In fairness, when you ask a correspondent who is near Myanmar or even in Myanmar, what's in it for us? They will be very well in explaining what is in it for us. So they could even build up an argument on why it is important for us to be caring about it. So that could be one of the ways to try to circumvent uninterest, but that's very difficult, and they keep trying that, and it's one of the more challenging ways of gaining attention. What current philosophers and researchers are also trying to do, and this is much more difficult, and this is also playing the long game, is that we try to look for a kind of solidarity that is not based on what's in it for me anymore. And we try to reframe our sense of care, and this is different from a sense of morality. So from a moral perspective, we already should be able to do something about it. We know that now, but we have to be able to reframe our way of thinking in a way changes from a I want something from this to a sense of solidarity. That is a completely different way of telling a story, and that is something that journalists are currently also thinking about. So maybe you can say something.
But before we go to Stan, one question I want to ask, connecting to that, is if you look for that solidarity that would be broader and not based on self-interest, that presupposes a kind of an equal validity of every human life. Whether somebody's living in New Zealand, in Mali, or in Ghent, they all matter equally. That's a moral position. Can we put that into practice though? 7 billion people, can we care for 7 billion people?
I think we cannot care for 7 billion people, obviously. I do think that it's not so much the calculation, the calculated idea that you mentioned now, we are all equal, we already know that. We've already been aware of that, or we've already agreed on that for quite a long time. We are aware of our moral ideas, at least in the countries where we are from, in the Western settings. Dominant way of thinking is we are all equal. The challenge is going to be that we don't know it, but that we feel it, we're aware of it at a level that we can do something with it. And even then, it will be a challenge not only to feel it, but then taking a next step, which is to do something about it.
Younis, quickly, Eline says in the West, at least we take a principled position that everybody is equal. From what you said before, I would infer that a lot of people in the world have big doubts that we do actually think everybody is equal.
Yes, the credibility of Europe is suffering heavily under their not intervening in these conflicts, or not even representing it in their media coverage. So the credibility of Europe being having a high moral standard, and I would like to add something to the aspect that you mentioned. That you said, solidarity is one very important aspect. I would also say that, especially in Africa, maybe also worldwide, there's also a historical responsibility. I mean, if you look at the conflict in Sudan, it has its roots in colonialism. It's very clear that the roots for all these conflicts, especially those, because I read a lot about it in Sudan, it has all to do with colonialism. So there is a historical responsibility for talking about it, even if you say, I don't care about it now because there will not be many Sudanese refugees coming here. This is also something, if it's of interest for us or not, it's very difficult for Sudanese to make their way until Europe. So if this conflict would be in Libya, I think we would be way more aware of this, because, I mean, there's only the Mediterranean Sea, and then it's of interest for us. But we know that Sudanese people, they rather flee in the direction of Ethiopia or southern Sudan or Chad or Egypt, because they also don't have the funds to make this way. So this is definitely also
which is two different things. One is, again, the question how much of the conflict will impact on us, either indirectly or by migration or whatever. The other thing is, do we see the responsibility that we have, and thirdly maybe, do we treat every human being as an equal human being to us?
Yeah, this is what I meant when I said the credibility, and I can tell you from exchange with people in Sudan, and not only my family, that I heard this sentence very often that say it's only a repetition of what we experienced with them all the centuries ago. So, and if we all live in a globalized society, and we have So we can get information from all corners of the world, and then we hear in Europe that we have the same values and every human being is equal. Then we must also know that this not covering of this conflict or not intervening leads to that people will say, okay, we're not as equal as them. Yeah, and for them, there are two main reasons. Sudanese are mainly black people. I'm half German, half Sudanese. This is why I look like this. And the other reason is, they say, because we're Muslims. And I think this is also leading to a more polarized position in the world.
Quick question on that. Do people in Sudan expect something from the Arab world? I mean, we're looking obviously to how we react as an audience or in politics, but Sudan is, in a sense, also halfway an Arab country. Do they expect something from Arab countries that can make a difference in aid or in politics, in diplomacy?
Yes, what I observed at the beginning of this conflict, that Sudanese people turned to every direction where they hoped for help. If it was the African Union, the Arab Union, the European Union, the US, we turned in every direction and we found that everybody has some direct or indirect interest there and nobody is acting. And so Sudanese people realized nobody will act. For example, the involvement of the United Arab Emirates in this conflict leads to a situation where nobody in the Arab Union even wants to position itself in this conflict, because, I don't know the reasons, I'm not a political analyst, but nobody is positioning himself or herself.
Which leads to the effective feeling of we're on our own.
We are all on our own, and what I said earlier, this feeling of, okay, if this is over, we don't want to have anything from you anymore. And the same sentence they also say to the Arab Union, and also to the African Union.
Stan, we've been talking about these different elements that distance our media or the public from conflicts. How much of that do you get as response to your reporting? Because you do some efforts, you do bring, whenever it's possible, some of that unseen suffering on the screen. Do you experience reactions from the audience that underline that, why are you talking about them? Let them take care of themselves, that kind of stuff. Do you get that kind of reactions, and does that matter to the broadcaster as such?
It's difficult to get reactions from your audience. On Twitter, people react, but X is not the best medium to have an idea what the society thinks. Huh?
Thank God.
There's a lot of negative. Why should we send money to these people? But when I make something about an unseen conflict, and my report is on our website, then we see that lots of these reports, especially when they are personal, they tell a personal story, are very well viewed. So people click on it and look at it. It's not that they don't want to see it, but our editors, which is my first public, they are afraid of bringing too much of these unseen conflicts. I really need everything to convince them before to go somewhere. And I use things like migrants, for example. And when I want to go to Mali, then I mention migrants might come to Europe, and then, okay, there's something in it for us. That's a good idea. Once I'm there, I don't make the story about migrants. I make the stories I want to tell, what is happening there. But that is an argument that helps, that works for editors before they let you go.
Do you have, beyond your own personal experience and work environment. But do you have the feeling that in our approach of conflicts in the rest of the world, racism is there and plays a role in why and why not we are reporting and how we report about these stories?
I wouldn't say racism, but people watch to reports when they recognize themselves in one way or another.
Identify themselves.
Like Ukraine, which is in Europe, or even Israel and Gaza, or Albania, Kosovo. But it's more difficult in Sudan or Congo to identify yourself with someone there. So that's the thing I always try to do when I make a report. First, portray them as normal people with their dreams and expectations and worries about going to school and like we have. So the people can a little bit identify with them and then tell the story. And that's something that helps if you can do that.
You can overcome the one of the classics in media is the kilometer rule, as we call it. The more distant an event is or a people is, the harsher the reality should be before we reported it. I interviewed Anjan Sundaram just recently, and in his book Stringer that he wrote from Congo, he says at a certain stage, death is the best argument to get something into the news, but for the Congo it wasn't enough anymore. So many people were dying that mere death didn't suffice. We needed a lot of people at the same time, or gruesome deaths, or...
Let me give you an example about that. In 2017 there was this Hurricane Irma going to Florida, and all news stations from all over the world went to Florida to see the arrival of Irma and what would happen. At the end there were 50 deaths, something like that. But a few weeks before, there was a rainstorm in Sierra Leone, and with a landslide, a very big landslide in Freetown, with I think 1,000 deaths. That was a very, very little piece in our TV news, while the Hurricane Irma was for days in the news and opening the news. So these 1,000 deaths were in Sierra Leone were less important than the 50 deaths in the United States, in Florida. And I used that as an argument for my editor, that to show this difference, that this should be the reason why we should go to Sierra Leone. And I went 1 month later to Sierra Leone to tell the story 1 month or 2 months later. Yeah.
But basically, the question is not even distance. It's not kilometers. It's identification.
Yeah.
It's cultural distance.
Yeah.
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 That's, I mean, it's in that sense a good example, because we usually refer to distance as one of the main reasons, but distance is a very relative thing. Sierra Leone or even Sudan is not that far from us if you compare it to Florida.
Also, when it affects us. For example, in Ukraine, we had the problem with the grain coming out, and the oil prices and gas prices that went up, which affected us directly. So that's also a reason or an argument to go somewhere where it's more easy to go as a journalist.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something that you said just before, when you said, when I go and report, I try in the first place to make the people I'm reporting on, to portray them as full human beings, with dreams, with family lives, with normal personal ambitions. And that's something that I would like to delve in a little bit deeper in. We're talking about unseen conflicts, unseen lives. for me, the question is, should we talk about unseen suffering, or is the real debate about unseen lives? Are we just not reporting enough about what the rest of the world is living in a day-to-day life, or going through without somebody pulling over a trigger?
Well, news is something new, is what deviates from the normal. Like, we don't bring elections in Ghana and Botswana because these elections are very democratically open and with a normal transfer of power. So I never went to Botswana. Everything is good in Botswana. So I think we should do that more often. Because it's also very destructive for the image we have from Africa. If you only go when there's conflict and when there's misery, then people have the idea that Africa is full of hunger and war and misery. So I tried that, of course, to make reports on what's going good, and I did that in some years ago, a series of pieces in our TV news from Eastern Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, and only good news stories, only normal things like garbage recycling in Kampala and those things. And the purpose was to send them or to broadcast these TV reports every other day, so every 2 days. But I noticed that after 1 week, they were already postponing the broadcast of these reports because
there was no urgency.
Yeah, there was no urgency, and at the end I really had to call, please broadcast that now because it will not be valid anymore. So it's difficult to sell normal things happening in distant countries.
Eline, it connects with the work of the correspondent of the site in the Netherlands, where I'm forgetting his name now, the guy that started it.
Rob
Wijnberg. In his book, The Nieuwsfabriek, he says that news is as bad as sugar. It's addictive, it makes you sick, and if all you eat is sugar or all you watch is news, you'll probably die soon, or it makes you completely, it's intoxicating in many ways. So if we're talking about making more conflicts visible, again, also for you, is the anti-virus here not more conflicts, but more reporting on what is really going on in the world and what people are working, and is that what people would be watching? That's the other question. But first, do we need more lives rather than more conflicts?
Yes, I think so. And I think your example of creating positive stories related in countries on the African continent is a very good example of a kind of journalism that is also that they also try to establish at the correspondent. The aim of this kind of journalism is to balance the worldview that we have. We currently only have negative news, and that creates a sense of everything is negative. The world is ending. There is nothing we can do anymore. So that sense of powerlessness, it keeps coming back when we only present the negative developments. And by presenting positive developments besides the negative developments, could be able to create a more accurate view of what's going on in the world, and it will also contrast what is going well with what is not going well. So by considering Ghana and how well it is going over there, and then presenting what is happening in Sudan, we might also be able to see it in a frame where we realize that it is a very diverse continent, with a lot of diversity amongst the people, where some are doing well and others are not doing well, and those who are not doing well are in need of our help.
Do you have an idea as a researcher whether the audience would follow that kind of news? Because it's an interesting moral argument. The Stance editors will say, nice idea, why do we postpone it? There's no urgency, people are not responding to it. If it's a conflict, if it's suffering, then at least it triggers reaction. If it is good news...
There's two things that could be, that are proposed at the moment. And what is being, well, there's more, but I would now highlight two things. For one, at the moment, the journalistic cultural practice is very cynical and very negative. And this is not because all journalists are cynical. In fact, a lot of journalists, especially correspondents, are very ideological, and they really try to gain attention for what's going on. It's often the editors that are more cynical, and based on very old ideas on what is valuable as news. In fact, there is this notion, this concept that we call it news values. So what is valuable as news? And this is very often based on a couple of things that need to be there in order for something to be valuable for the news. And it is based on research that is from the 70s. So it's quite old. But still, the journalistic practice very often bases their ideas on those news values. So in order for things to change, it would have to start at the journalistic culture, the daily practice, where that negative and that cynical way of viewing both the audiences as well as what is news, there could already change something. But there is a second thing that is also necessary, because even if you would present negative stories and positive stories for a much more balanced and accurate view of what's going on in the world, even then, when negative stories are being told, there is still that sense of powerlessness. So that also needs to be addressed. So I think when you're offering news about Sudan and what is going on there, rather than only talking about this is going on, and then just leave the audience with it, not knowing anything what they can do about it, there needs to be offered ideas on how you can respond. Concrete things, organizations, and they are there. We are just not so aware about it. What I know from Sudan is there is, for instance, and this is a local thing, but still, I found very interesting, a very active WhatsApp group amongst the diaspora in the Netherlands anyway, and they are actively looking for ways where they can try to find fundings, or they even have information amongst each other in Khartoum and outside Khartoum, and they keep telling each other where to go, where it's safe, where it's not safe, and it's very accessible for us to be looking into that and to be involved with that. But that's
a former news editor in VRT tried that and put his head out and talked about constructive journalism. That was chopped off by almost everybody, inside and outside. So, Stijn, is there still any space for constructive journalism?
Yes, I think so. It's something we do, actually, but we can't talk about it anymore. We can't say this is constructive journalism. But yes, it's something we try to do. Also, when I'm abroad in a conflict or a crisis, always try to look for things which brings solutions, and to focus on that, for example. Of course, aid organizations. I think aid helps. People think aid doesn't help. I want to show how aid helps with a simple box of plum peanut, for example. You can save lives of many children, which is very simple. And that is something we try to show, of course. And this powerlessness, yes, that's something I hear a lot from my family, for example, who see the reports on Gaza, but also reports I mean, what can we do? That's the thing I hear the most after I do a presentation also.
Yeah. Younis, I want to return to the question of unseen lives and how we present in the media the rest of the world. I understand fully that at this crucial moment you're asking for reporting on the conflict and what is happening and the suffering in Sudan. But do you think it would be happening more if we would have been reporting on Sudan more? Well, there was some reporting maybe during the uprising or the popular protest, but even that was very limited. So the question is, do you see the avenue of more reporting about lives, about realities in the rest of the world as almost a precondition for proper reporting when conflicts do break out?
That's, for me, a very difficult question to answer because I'm not a journalist and I'm not a news expert. Yeah, but what I can tell you is, in the beginning there was, I would say, quite good media coverage on the conflict in the first, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks. And the reason for me, and also this is how it is perceived by many Sudanese, is because there were still a lot of expats there. There were still a lot of European and Americans there that didn't get out of the country. I can tell you, from my personal observation, the moment nearly all diplomats, all expats left the country, the media coverage was also going nearly to zero. And I wanted to, it's also adding up to your question, I also wanted to say media coverage alone will not help the people. Yeah, it's good that it will give them good feeling, maybe for a moment when they realize, okay, people are seeing our suffering. But what would help, I think, is my personal belief, is that media and journalists would try to dig a little bit deeper to explain what are the root causes of this conflict. Because just covering the conflict and say 150,000 people have died, nobody can imagine what this means. These mere numbers, 150,000, nobody knows what it means if you see 150,000 dead bodies in front of you. But understanding the root causes of the conflict would help the side of the audience, but also those who are in the middle of this conflict, because they themselves, I can tell you, Sudanese themselves, they don't understand their conflict anymore. We found there are now proved reports of Colombian mercenaries in Sudan. No Sudanese understand. Many Sudanese didn't know about the country Colombia before, yeah? But now we have seen passports, we have seen Colombian mercenaries, we know about UAA, security companies who organize mercenaries from all over the world to fight a war, which Sudanese themselves don't understand. So you would help us and European audience by analyzing, explaining what's really going on there. And then I think people will be way more motivated to help, to find solutions, to call someone, and to make really an impact, because then you know, okay, this is the problem, this is where I have to address. I wanted also to add something to the point you made just earlier when you asked, does racism still play a role? I would say yes. I would say racism still plays a role, not in the negative buzzwords, not in the negative intention, but in the not seeing some parts of the world, because there's a lack of representation in journalism. I mean, how many Arabs, how many African journalists do work in Belgium in comparison to those without a migration history? I would say there's a lack of representation which leads to a blind eye in Africa or certain conflicts. And this is what I mean when I say yes, there is racism, but not intentional racism.
On our news desk, the foreign news desk, we only have one Arabic-speaking colleague. So For example, to follow the social media on Sudan, you need to speak Arabic. And although a lot speak perfect English and there is a lot of posts in English, but that is a problem. Our newsroom is it's not a representation of our society.
Yeah. So that certainly plays a role in what we see. I think that's a very valid point. The angle that we take is in a sense premeditated by the position that we have, and it takes a lot to overcome that. But I want to follow up on another point, Younis, because you said when all the correspondents left, the news fell away. That can easily be because the correspondents are the ones that feed the news agencies or the big, what then is called legacy media in the Anglo-Saxon world, and they dominate the news production worldwide. How many journalists from Sudan are still active today? Can they still work in this conflict?
I know just about one for sure, who's still there in Omdurman, and he's reporting on a daily basis via his social media channel and also I think on Al Arabiya. And there was also, I think she's Sudanese but now living in the US, Hiba Mahmoud I think is her name. But she left Sudan in a very early stage because she was also threatened by the RSF. So she had to leave. But I think Al-Mirdad Hassan is the only one remaining on site.
I'm asking the question because, well, in Gaza, this genocidal war that Israel is waging against Gaza has been targeting journalists working in Gaza, trying to silence them. It's not just, I mean, as a foreign correspondent, you can't hardly get in at all, but there was not a lack of Gazan Palestinian journalists reporting, but they've been targeted killing, actually. So I'm bringing this up to see in this whole universe of reporting of news, we often overlook the local journalist as a source and as a contributor to the stories that we are looking for. How important are they, Stan?
Well, for me, the local journalists are my fixers. So when we go somewhere, we always hire a fixer, that's someone who knows the country and who knows the stories, who has a lot of phone numbers and knows where to go and guides us there. So in that perspective, they are very important. But during Corona, we couldn't travel anymore. And then for the first time, we let these fixers and these journalists, local journalists, make our stories. So we asked them, for example, in Kenya, there was that termites that was eating all the crops. We asked them to make something about it. And the images were good and the interviews were good, but the thing, what he made of it didn't make the bridge from his local story to the Belgian public.
No.
So I really had to ask him his raw images and make something different of it. His questions were meant for a local audience, a Kenyan audience, and not for a Belgian audience. So that's something we have to overcome.
Yeah.
But then I think it would be a very good thing to indeed use these local journalists to tell their stories.
Anjan Sundaram, and you read the interview that I published today with him. He compares it to colonial extraction to a certain extent. He says it's colonial capital sending out the news reporters. They use the local stringers or journalists, extract the news from them, bring it back home and monetize it and put their names on it and get the prices if everything goes well. How can we counter that extractive neo-colonial news relationship that we have. I don't question what you said, because I think, and Anjan recognized that in the interview as well, there needs to be a bridge between the local expertise and the global audience. But maybe we should start giving them credit and name them, at least pay them well and name them as co-authors of our pieces, because we wouldn't be able to make our pieces without them.
You're right. I think they're paid well. They're well paid. But we should give their names. You're right. That's something we do it from time to time. We do it when something exceptional happens. But yeah, we should do that more.
It's not always
a starting point.
Yeah, it's not always easy, and I refer. I asked also a reaction from Samuel Baker Bianchi, who's a Rwandese journalist who had to flee the country because of repression, and for journalists in Rwanda, it's not even always advisable to have their names on the stories that we co-produce. So Younis, how you think that will work in Sudan?
No, I just want to tell from practice, I mean, in Sudan it's not safe for a journalist to report anymore. The first one who's being killed is a journalist. Yeah, so we must see that this guy who's still over there and showing his face every day in the camera, he's a real hero, because he knows if they get him, the first thing they will do is kill him. Yeah. So this is one reason why we don't get representation from inside, and maybe this is also even more a responsibility for Western journalists, because they are heavily armed, or say they have their security around them, which local journalists don't have. Yeah. So this is one thing, and the other thing that you must know: the first building that was bombed and burned when the conflict broke out was the Ministry of Communication. Yeah. So the first thing they do, the rebels and the military themselves.
It's an awkward recognition of the importance of journalism, of course.
This is what I want to say.
But it is, in a sense, a negative.
And it took, I can tell you, it took Sudanese people like half a year to understand on which side do we stand. Are we on the side of rapid support forces, or on the side of the military? Because we are getting news and via social media, which we can't explain. We can't evaluate these news. Yeah, and everybody. I mean, I just give you an example. There was a few weeks ago, the military showed some videos that they were advancing on Bahri. Bahri is one part of the capital where the RSF have their headquarters. On the same day, so they showed it on social media. On the same day, the rapid support forces showed pictures of themselves on the bridge on which they might have crossed, and saying, "Where's the military now?" Yeah. Yeah? So there is no military. So everybody's confused, because there is a lack of journalism, the lack of local journalists. Yeah, and this is what I want to say. It's this lack of representation, lack of journalism, lack of news, proven news. Yeah, makes it even more responsible for Western journalists to try to get a way in there. And I think there are ways, but I agree it's very difficult and dangerous.
I'm very happy that you bring up the social media, because I was going to look at that, because we've been talking about legacy media, about big media or small. I mean, I'm from a small magazine. Stijn is from the biggest redaction of the country. But more and more, both for VRT or for newspapers, they're confronted with the reality that they're not the main producers of images, of news, of debate about a conflict. It's on social media, and people are constructing their own ideas about it by plucking and looking at what they trust, and they trust what they believe, and they believe in what they trust. So how do we get out of that? Or is it, let me put it another way, Eileen, is this enormous social media an enrichment of our reporting of our news environment, of our awareness of what is happening in the world? Or is it, as Younis said, just blurring everything out and people don't even know when they're in the conflict what side they're on?
I think it's both. And I think that's the exciting part of it. For me as a researcher anyway, because social media has been developing incredibly fast in the past couple of decades, in the past decades. Just 10 years ago, when you look at research from 10 years ago, is already redundant because there is new media, new kinds of media, new cultures around it. So it's really exciting as a researcher to see what possibilities there are. At the same time, the initial optimism that researchers had about social media, Web 2.0, the democratization of news and user-generated content, citizen journalism, all those buzzwords, creating an empowerment for those who are on the scene, telling their own stories, emancipating themselves. That kind of optimism is not there anymore, because there is, what you say, there's a lot of blurring. There's the filter bubbles, the algorithms that create the story that we already want to hear, and it recreates itself the entire time. So whatever you believe is constantly being fed into your timeline. So every time you see the news and you click on it and it confirms what you believe, then you keep getting into that bubble. There is a mess on the ground, which makes it more difficult to access, and it's more difficult to verify anything, what is true and what is not true. But the optimism isn't entirely squashed down. There is still a lot of possibilities, and we have to look at that in the future as well.
Yeah. Younis, you told us before that you started out completely obsessed with trying to follow anything that was there. Then it got you almost into a depression, so you had to filter out. How do you follow the news now? What's your source? How do you deal with that?
First of all, I really like what you said, because I also have these two feelings via social media or towards social media. On the one side, if we wouldn't have had social media, we wouldn't have seen the side or the perspective of Gaza, because there are no local journalists, there are no international journalists allowed into Gaza. So this is the only opportunity to see this perspective. On the other side, as you just rightly said, it's abused or it's misused, and everybody uses this for telling his version of the story, and the algorithm feeds this, and especially young people, they're not really able to identify by critically thinking, is this right, is this wrong? So normally I would say we need journalism to fact check things, coming back to your question, I only follow social media now, I only follow a few channels now. Some where I know, okay, they are trustful, they check their news, and only on certain days during the week. This is my strategy in dealing with it, because otherwise I will not be able to fulfill my daily duties, especially regarding my family or my work, because sometimes I start looking at social media and then it takes me 2 hours to get away from it. So this is my strategy in dealing with it.
Yeah. Stan, how important is it for mainstream media to navigate the social media universe? I can see Verte, it has news on Instagram. It's on every TikTok and everything. So you try the mainstream media are trying to wriggle their way into the universe of social media, but how do you deal with the rowdiness and the distortions of social media vis-a-vis the news that you follow?
Like algorithms and...
Yeah, algorithms, and even, I mean, algorithms is one thing. There's the news fabrication that is happening intentionally and with big money. Then there's very biased reports. I mean, you've got everything.
What we have now and what we didn't have 10 years ago is a fact-check redaction. So, and this redaction is growing. There are more and more people working for it. And we also have a team that is following up on the algorithms, so to be able to squeeze in the other news so we can reach every person with our news on Instagram and these social media. And I think for the mainstream media like ours, it's important to be a beacon of trust and credibility in this chaos of news from social media. Like Younis said, he chooses channels that he knows they fact-check their news. So I think media like VRT or The Standard or Mo should be these important beacons of credibility. And I think the longer we live with social media, the more people, and especially young people, I see it, my children are 18, 16, and 14, I see that they check a lot of social media, but they always come back to check with the trusty ones.
But mainstream media want to occupy a social media space. They need to comply with the logic. If there's some, I follow news because 2 years ago I was working with students of journalism and producing some stories, and they told me that their main news source was news. So I thought I have to check that. A lot of it is just rubbish, honestly. It's the formatting makes it, for me, less credible than what the content deserves. So how do you deal with, I mean, you're not ordering, you're not the ones making decisions, in a sense. It's the platforms that decide who gets in and what you need to do to get in.
Another problem is that our editors and coordinators and chiefs are also constantly looking into the analytics, and because they have
the clicks
and how long they read and where they stop reading, and how long they watch the videos. So all this analysis, they're following up on that, and that, yes, is not good. I think that's, and we see that everywhere. I think that is a very, very bad evolution that we should stop. The journalists should be deciding what will be in the news, and how to bring it. And now it's the public, it's the audience that.
Try selling Myanmar to your editors.
But I think we're learning and we're trying to find a balance between both. But also for me, what I see on news is sometimes very frustrating. Yes.
Yeah. Good. I won't push you any further on that. Elin, you want to add to that?
Yes.
Briefly, because we're wrapping up.
I think it's there's two things that I'm thinking related to journalism and social media. I think, for one, is that journalists who present themselves as knowing what's important, it's one of the basic ideas as a journalist. You tell what's going on and what's important to know. But I think journalists have to also comply with media logic that social media also has, and rather than simply presenting themselves as specialists of what's happening, I think journalists could also present themselves as specialists of what is truth and what is fake. So rather than seeking out the news, journalists would be looked after not to seek out news, but to seek out what is real and what is fake. So what is actually verifiable. And that is something that I currently feel journalists are underselling that point, that specialization of themselves.
Fact checking.
Yes, so I
but
get why it gets bigger, and fact checking.
Can I just
yeah.
intercede, because fact checking sometimes becomes rather trivial as well. I mean, everything's getting fact-checked these days. The sheep hasn't been shaven for 2 years. Is this true or is this fake? I mean, I don't care. So truth and false are different categories than fake or not fake for me.
I think it's something that journalists can emphasize more, and I agree. It's more than only fact checking. It's also presenting themselves as specialists of truth. And
But
truth
that's our
is
main
bigger.
task.
Yes.
Our main task.
Yeah.
Finding the truth.
Yes. And a second thing that I'm currently thinking about, because I've been talking with quite a lot of journalists for my current research, and I am surprised how little many of the journalists actually know about the current social media, kinds of social media, and the affordances it has. And I think in the future it has to be more normalized to include social media as one of the more dominant modes of media that young people at least use, and then see what you can use in it in your advantage.
Good. Younis?
One last thing, because it in a way supports what you just said. I fully agree with you that we need fact-checking, but we have another issue that we have not touched today, which is trust in media.
Yeah.
I did my own research on survey, you could say, with 650 participants, and one of the key findings was that they don't trust media, German media. I don't want to talk about.
No, it's better in Belgium.
Yeah. I don't know. I can only speak for Germany and for a certain group that self-selected to participate in this survey. But one big issue is trust in media. So, and I think we need to also think, how do we regain trust? Because media, news agencies are the only institutions, or hopefully can be in the future again, those institutions who we can rely on when they report on something, because we cannot rely on anyone who picks out his phone out of his pocket and gives his personal opinion on something. We need more trust in social media, in journalism, but this has to be regained.
Yep.
Yeah.
And one thing maybe that would be of use is, because you specifically say regain trust in journalism, a lot of media are forgetting how important journalism is for media. It's more about entertainment, about selling stuff, rather than giving space to good journalism and investing in that as well. Good. We wanted to have at least 15, well, it's going to be 10 minutes to see if there are questions or remarks that you as an audience want to make. And somebody should be going around with a microphone, and there's somebody already over there that would love to use that microphone. Yeah. Go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you for the really good debate. A friend of mine once said jokingly that if Toyota stopped producing those amazing SUVs, those conflicts would stop. But he was joking, of course, but there's no doubt that if many companies stopped producing weapons, most of those conflicts would stop, because basically they cannot carry it on without weapons. And considering most of these weapon-producing companies are located in the democratic countries, what is the power of people against these companies? Is it feasible to ask these companies or the governments to stop producing weapons? Is it feasible? If it is feasible, why hasn't it happened already? And if it is not happening, is it really a democracy we're living in these countries?
Yeah. Okay, so let me rephrase it a little bit. If the weapons used in conflicts are produced in our countries, how much of a responsibility is that giving our public, our democracy, and our media to highlight that and to do something about it. We didn't touch upon that aspect of responsibility, but anyone wants to respond quickly to that? Stan?
Yeah, I think we don't do it enough. And explain, for example, how weapons get to Yemen. Part of it, Belgian weapons get to Yemen. We don't ask it hard enough to our ministers at the Walloon side and federal about this weapon in herstal. FN herstal? Nee?
FN, yeah.
FN. But I can't say any more about that. I think we have the responsibility to ask that, and I think we don't do it enough.
Younis, should we make it more about our responsibility more than their suffering?
I would say, first of all, thank you for the question, and it's a very important question because I see it as a means to regain trust.
Yeah. To
regain trust. If you would ask these questions, very critical, maybe for example also asking why how is it called? Aktien in German? Aktien? Sorry.
Actioners, the shareholders.
The shareholders of weapon companies after Trump won the election, boom, it went just through the roof, yeah? So just ask these questions, and then you are starting to regain trust because we see, okay, they are starting to ask the right questions.
Reality, of course, is that today those who want more weapons productions getting the floor, and those who would plead for getting rid of the arms industry are nowhere to be heard. Anyway, good question and an important point. If the microphone can move over here.
He's at the top. Here I am.
Yeah, there you are.
Two persons.
Okay.
I have two persons for the question.
Let's have them both briefly. Thank you. Yeah.
Earlier we spoke about trust in the media and morality. And I was wondering, because I think it was mentioned that in general the EU or Europe has its principles when it comes to valuing everyone's life as much as they should, so that one life should be equal as another. But I wonder, has that ever been the case if it wasn't about Europe? Because if we look back at the history of Europe, whether it's colonization, whether it's Second World War, whether it's how we deal with migration at the moment, has this ever been the case where indeed one life has been as equal as another? And at the same time, I wonder if we are talking about trust in media, is it possible to have that trust in media for certain groups if the way people are portrayed, if the way certain people are portrayed is making them inhuman, making them not feel human, not talking about them as if they are humans, whether it's on asylum seekers, whether it's people in Gaza, if the language that is used is so biased, how can certain people trust that same media? And I also wonder, isn't there also a role to play or responsibility for newsrooms where there is almost none diversity, it's not inclusive at all, that it's very white, very Eurocentric, and that is a part I missed in that debate, so I was wondering if you could comment on that, because I was quite surprised by the interventions earlier on this.
Okay.
Thank you.
There was somebody else. Let's have that second question.
I think, shouldn't we start with this question and then move on to the next question?
Sure. No?
I think you raised really good points. I think what my response to this is when you're talking about media and morality, and then the second part of your question, the actual dehumanization of people who are portrayed by media, I think they are two parts of the same question, and that is how do we value people in daily life? And I think we have to differentiate the ideal with the practice, and the ideal, the moral fundaments that we base our society on is that all human beings globally are equal. That's the ideal. But when we look into the practice, we see that is not the case. That is not what we actually carry out in daily life. And this is, of course, also where you see that sort of like the moral discomfort that audiences experience. That's what I found in my research anyway. There is so many people who are aware of that discrepancy between what should be done and what is being done. And this is a conflict, a constant conflict that people are being confronted with every time that they see these kind of suffering, images of people who are suffering, which is for a lot of people a reason to stop watching it because of that moral discomfort. I'm not saying there's a solution straight away, but I recognize the unfairness of that situation, and I agree that there's a big task to try to overcome this, but that's a big challenge.
One could even say, as I listened to the question, when Younis said we need to regain trust, the question becomes, do we even deserve the trust that we need, given the way we portray people, the way we treat people, the way we are redaction teams as well, and then the language that we use?
Thank you again for the question. It's exactly what I meant earlier when I said I think we have to talk about racism if we talk about media and journalism, and I think we definitely need more diversity sensitivity. We need more training on unconscious biases. We need, but the most thing, or the thing that will definitely help, is more representation of the diverse society. And I think then we will get to a point. We will need more critical whiteness, definitely, because otherwise it will always be slogans, but you will always have this lack of perspectives.
Yeah.
What they tell me when I ask about diversity on our in our newsroom is that they don't find enough people who want to solicit to become a journalist at VRT, for example. There are some projects where they do diversity stages. How do you call that? Internships, and where we at schools are really, not me, but these teams looking for people to show them to, our newsroom, to get them into that. But it doesn't work until now, is what they say.
Well,
they don't have enough
I
candidates. I don't know.
I agree. It is very difficult to find people. I think that is one of the root issues. But there is, I think, an even more problematic root issue that is also needs to be looked into. I've been part of a journalism education program a couple of years ago, and what you see is that still the newsroom and news practice and culture is rather conservative and unconsciously or consciously still often seeking out people they are familiar with. So, and this is something that there is now much more an increase of awareness about. But this is one of the issues that we need to look into that newsroom as well. When you start to look for people who are more diverse, it's not just a diversity in appearances, but it's also a difference or a diversity in not in opinions, but also in the way you express them, for instance. And what I saw in this program with journalists was there were a couple of people from a minority group, and they were very political about some of their views. And for being very focused on those issues, they were sort of not or less accepted because they were too outspoken about certain things. And this, I think, is something that we have to look for. We have to sort of reflect on how do we deal with these different kinds of not just opinions or appearances, but also different ways of discourse and different ways of framing.
question is, what do we change in order to be more diverse, and not just how can what we are become more diverse? But I have to ask somebody here, because it's 3 o'clock, so we should stop normally, and I don't want to interfere in the next program. That's my problem. I'm not in a hurry to get out. Is there anybody that can inform me that, do we need to stop?
5 minutes, okay.
Okay,
Maybe
one more
last
question. Wie krijgt de telefoon? De microfoon.
I don't know.
Hier vooraan.
To choose.
I'll try and ask the question quickly. I heard a lot of excuses about why it's difficult on following the news, for example, in Gaza. It makes us feel powerless, or makes us emotionally uncomfortable. What I've not heard a lot about is why we are not informing the audience about our shared responsibility in the conflicts. And that means framing the conflicts as something that is being carried out by the powers that be at the moment. Also the link between, for example, Gaza and the climate crisis, and the allies of the United States and the Western companies, the oil companies, and the political gain that is being garnered from continuing these conflicts. And I think by framing the conflicts in such a way that it is seen as a systemic problem, that we are all responsible for what is happening, and being responsible might make you feel uncomfortable, but it means that you have to speak and you have to voice your concerns, because you are not just a passive audience that is allowed to be uncomfortable and turn away. It's our shared responsibility.
Okay.
And I had one quick question about how does there is kind of silent censorship at editorial level, where it's not only the clicks they're interested in, it's also in what stories are allowed to be told. In the past year, I've never seen it so blatantly obvious that there are biased reporting from Western governments or Western media compared to, for example, Al Jazeera, or all of the independent journalism like Ziteo or Owen Jones that are starting to speak about the other side of the conflict that is not being reported in Western media.
Okay, thank you. I would say final remarks as a response to this question.
I think you were referring to the reporting on Gaza at the end and the conflict in the Middle East. Yeah. Yeah, I think again, after the question about the weapons, that we need to explain better, to dig deeper, like you said, well, I cannot speak for all media and all journalists, but there is a lot of work to do. I admit that, yes, definitely.
Eileen?
Yes, I agree as well. I think the responsibility is to start, and I think what you're, what's interesting about a sense of moral responsibility when you present it as such, also to the audience. So we have a role in this situation. I think it's a very good step towards being involved with the conflict or with events that are happening far away. And I think for it to become more tangible for people to read about it, I think it's important to not only emphasize the bigger processes that are happening, but also the small ways that you can be active parts of those big processes. So rather than only present the in-depth structures, it would be interesting to see how can we then consider our own role, not simply by being aware of it, but maybe raising our voice, sharing stories, become part of something. And I think that is a part of constructive journalism, where you can also look into, well, or we're not allowed to say constructive journalism anymore, but it's part of the
No, you
journalistic
can.
culture. Fair point.
I can't.
I think it's part of, it would be interesting if that would become the norm in news stories, not just telling what is happening, but also telling what your own part of it in it is or could be. So, yeah.
Younis? Younis, sorry.
I didn't hear a question mark in this question, so I can only fully agree. And but I can also tell you, and I'm observing the Belgian news a little bit. Come to Germany, and you will see what biased media is.
Good. On that positive note, I would like to thank the panel for their participation today and for their insights, for their sharing. I would also like to thank Sarah Zeebroek for making the artwork out of our stumbling around the difficult questions. And I would like to thank Arendt Instituut for setting this up. And of course, all of you who are not just an audience here, but who are active participants in the debate about news, how the news is made, how the news is received, and what kind of news environment we need and we want and we build for the coming generation. So thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the festival.